Hello listener. So, in my previous video about Indonesia, I briefly talked a little bit about East Front veterans serving in the Dutch army in Korea and in Indonesia. And there's not many who are named or anything, but one of them became a semi-famous person, and I'd like to talk a little bit about him. His name was Jan Montyn. He was born in 1924 in a fairly strict SGP Christian conservative household. He joined a National Socialist Nationale Jeugdstorm during the Second World War in 1942, and he trained in Austria to become a soldier. At age 19, he joined the Kriegsmarine as a sailor, which was in 1943. And he served on a minesweeper in the Baltic. His move to join the military was inspired by a heroic vision of a new Europe, somewhat inspired by the reactionary, as he saw it, ideas of his father's Christian conservatism, and by anti-Bolshevist ideas which had stuck from his education. Mainly, though, he was attracted to the promise of adventure and inspired by fascism's message of futurism, a new man, a new order, a new Europe, as was foreseen in Italian futurism. He was a very artistic man. He was very much inspired by the arts. The idea of the new order was a society similar to the older German nationalist concept of the Volksgemeinschaft. The eradication of class distinction through national unity, and all interests, whether private or public, were to be made secondary to the collective well-being of the people and the nation. The nation-state would lose relevance as a coalition of European nations, similar to the EU, would be established, though with more national sovereignty. This idea was particularly popular in British fascism, elaborated by Oswald Mosley in Europe, a Nation. The policy towards the New World was uncertain, but the world in this new order vision would be ruled by this new European power bloc. Within Europe, Germany would of course be the dominant power, as it is today in the EU, and in the arts there would be a new heroic ideal, and a revival of classicism would be embraced, which is exemplified by the art of, for example, Arno Breker and the buildings of Albert Speer. During Montain's service on the minesweeper, it was sunk by a torpedo attack, which he barely survived. He made it ashore on the Baltic and was promptly press-ganged as a naval infantryman to serve in the Courland pocket, where he served in the trenches. Where in Courland he was wounded in action and then transferred to the Oder line, where he witnessed the bombing of Dresden. He retreated westward in the face of the advancing Russians and ended up being captured by American forces. He escaped, then promptly joined the French Foreign Legion as a parachutist, with the purpose of serving in the Asian theater of the Second World War against Japan. When Japan surrendered, he defected and returned to the Netherlands, where his former friends and family distanced themselves from him as a collaborator. He ended up serving 3 years in prison for service in a foreign army and collaboration. To expunge his record, he joined the Dutch army to fight in Korea in 1950, to compensate his service under the Germans. This was a deal that was often offered to the lower ranks of Dutch veterans of the Eastern Front. He would be wounded in action twice during the Korean War. Again, during the Korean War, a lot of the troops that the Netherlands sent towards the international effort against North Korea were SS veterans, because these were the most ideologically committed anti-Bolshevists and the most experienced troops. Montyn was to an extent a committed anti-Bolshevist and had military experience, but he was not of the Waffen-SS, and he was not that strongly ideological. He was attracted by aesthetics mostly. After being demobilized, he had a crisis of conscience, and he became a committed pacifist, arguing against war, and he dedicated himself to being a painter, which was a career he ended up finding while being a curator in the Dutch army, which he was between 1955 and 1957. His paintings, his art style, does not really reflect any of his militaristic or heroic ideals of the new order which he had in his youth, but rather his paintings are of abstract organic forms, many times landscapes, as if seeing things through murky waters. His experience of combat, a painful memory by the time he became a painter, is not reflected in his art at all. He did see war again after the Korean War. He traveled to Vietnam as a war correspondent and to Cambodia as a humanitarian volunteer to help during the conflict with the Khmer Rouge. He did not see action again as a military man. He did not fight again. He set up a foundation to help Vietnamese orphans of the war while he was in Vietnam. And he traveled extensively elsewhere, mainly in Asia, but also in North Africa and in the Middle East. He would paint local landscapes in his distinctive style, and he became a fairly well-known artist in the Netherlands. Not one of the top grade, but well known enough that there would be expositions dedicated to him alone. Over time, his activities came to reflect more and more conventional leftist ideals, especially in the 70s and 80s. He worked for Doctors Without Borders, and the title of one of his last expositions in 2013 was called Tolerance Without Borders, which was held at the Rotterdam Kunsthal. Jan Montyn died in 2015 at age 90. There is a semi-fictionalized series, or a semi-fictionalized book, which are sort of his memoirs, written by Dirk Ayot Kooijman, which was written in consultation with Montyn himself and was published in 1982, and talks mainly about his experience in the several wars he served in, namely the Second World War and in Korea. Now, Montyn's interesting because he at once exemplifies two political extremes. He was a heroic soldier in his youth, and in his later years he was a pacifist humanitarian. Now, his experience of war likely shaped his politics in later life, which were very much dedicated to helping refugees, humanitarianism, tolerance, the promotion of tolerance, and so on and so on. And like the typical Salon socialist, he bought a house in France and lived there in a sort of bourgeois lifestyle, married an Asian woman, etc. Now, I don't particularly care for his art. I don't think it is particularly interesting. It has a fairly unique style, but it's not really my sort of thing. It has no themes that I mean, landscapes are nice, but it has no themes that I would support. And I especially do not care for his politics. But he did have an interesting life, and sometimes that is enough to learn things about someone. And perhaps it shows that men are shaped more by their circumstances than they think. The same person may become a frontline soldier fighting for hardline nationalism, but in another context he may be a bleeding heart humanitarian. Circumstances influence more than we think. There is a lot of group pressure, the social context, the zeitgeist, the messages in the media influence what instincts you have and how they are expressed. You may have the same instinct, because underlying both of these cases is a strong desire for adventure, away from the urban, away from the city, away from the mundane and the common life, the routine. It's very Faustian, it's very European, this spirit of adventure, to discover things, to see things, write it down, to fight, and to be a soldier artist in a way. But at the same time, when only able to express it within the context of the current culture of leftism, this instinct, of course, goes exclusively towards helping others and sacrificing yourself for the good of others and so on, and to not have a collective identity anymore. So again, it's interesting that the same person could be these two things during his life. That's Jan Montyn.